We don't have habitats for them on the surface of Mars. Humans, the Apollo missions, those astronauts were outside of Earth's gravity well for about a week. They were in deep space for about a week at most. And it's, Mars missions are years.
So, hello and welcome to another episode of Chatter. Today, I am talking to Eric Berger, who is the senior editor at Ars Technica, the senior space editor, I have to say, and author of a brand new book about SpaceX. So, welcome to the show, Eric.
Thank you very much, Josh.
No problem. So yes, as we were talking about before we got on, SpaceX is it seems like an inevitable success and a huge multi-billion-dollar company now. But I mean that wasn't always the case. So why don't you start with where you heard about SpaceX and what first got you interested in even just like looking or writing about them?
Right. So SpaceX has been around since 2002, but I really didn't start paying attention to them until much later. It was really about 2010. Period when they first launched their Falcon 9 rocket, and I covered space for most of that period, and really got interested in them in 2016. That was the time at which they landed their rocket on an autonomous drone ship for the first time. It was really quite stunning to see that first stage come back out of space, drop down, and there's this small ship in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, and it just pops, lands right down on it. And that was wild. Like I'd never seen anything like that before in my life. And it really got me wondering, how they did it and wanting to better understand, why they had been successful where so many other companies had failed. And so I'd started doing a little more research. And then in 2019, I got really serious about writing the book.
Mm. That image when I first saw them landing the rocket, I will actually never forget when you got to saw it. I heard someone describe it, especially one where they landed on the platform in the ocean as landing. It's like dropping a pencil from the top of the Empire State Building and trying to land it eraser up on a postage stamp.
I think that's exactly right. And you might want to throw in there like in the middle of a hurricane or something, because it's coming back through space or the upper atmosphere at several times the speed of sound. And the really technically challenging part of that actually is relighting the engines in the supersonic environment. If you can imagine like the rocket, is like it's engine first, sort of screaming through the atmosphere, and it's got to figure out how to light its engines in that kind of environment and then not blow up in the process. It's an enormous challenge. Yeah.
Why do you think, what in your opinion was like the driver behind trying to start the company in the first place?
Right. So Elon was pretty clear about that. He originally wanted to see humans, settle on Mars. Like he wanted humans to literally, he talks about it becoming a multi-planetary species. He's not like larking around. He's pretty serious about that. And originally he thought the way to do it was through NASA. He thought if you got more budget for NASA, they would be able to, build a transportation system to go to Mars, and, they would take it from there. But as he did more research into it, and realized, and this was back in 2001 when he was, wanted to do this little experiment where he would send a small biosphere to Mars, and have like plants growing in this biosphere on the surface of Mars. And he wanted to have a webcam that would stream this back to Earth. And he thought that would inspire people to fund, to provide more funding for NASA. It was pretty naive. And he realized as well that even if NASA got more funding, the way the US space industry was going, the price of launch was not going down, it was going up. And then NASA would not be able to afford any kind of Mars exploration program, even if it got more of a budget. And he got pretty frustrated as he looked at what Lockheed and Boeing were charging in terms of rocket launches. And he figured there's a better way to do this. And the first step toward, getting a settlement on Mars is really bringing down the cost of launch. So he said, I'm going to see if I can do it better and faster. And that was the genesis of SpaceX.
I've heard the story that he finally did the maths on a flight back from Russia where he tried to buy an intercontinental ballistic missile. It sounds like
Yeah.
something out of a TV show.
Well, he went over there several times, and he says that they were never really serious about it. Some of them were pretty disrespectful, and he said every time thought he was getting close to a price, and so this was just he wanted to buy an old ICBM from Russia to launch this tiny, biosphere to Mars. Who had one team of people working on the biosphere, and he was himself trying to procure the rocket launch. And he said the price just kept going up every time he got close to negotiations. And so he realized that they weren't really serious about it, selling it to him, and that there was probably a better way to do it anyway. Ultimately, I don't think that launching the biosphere was his motivation for founding SpaceX. I think it was his general frustration with the state of the space industry, both in the fact that he could not buy like a commercial launch in the United States for any kind of reasonable price. I mean, if he wanted at that time, it probably would have been $150 million. And so that's one reason why he went to Russia. And I think he felt frustrated by the fact that he had to go to Russia to find a commercial launch. Why was Russia, a former communist state, so much better at launching competitively than the United States was?
Why was that?
Well, it's complicated, and I don't want to go too deep maybe into space history, but NASA had decided in the 1980s and 70s it was going to rely on the space shuttle. And the US military wanted its own independent access to space. So it had given contracts to Lockheed and Boeing to develop rockets. And they essentially had a monopoly on those contracts, and they didn't really have any incentive to drive down prices. And so in contrast to what Russia and Europe were charging for their launch systems and we're talking about at this time, like the big market was like things like direct TV satellites going out to geostationary space. The US companies just were not competitive because they were able to get so much money from the military for their satellite launches.
Yeah, that makes sense. So Elon came along and decided that they were going to try and build reusable rockets. Like, why had no one tried this before?
Well, I mean, so NASA had built the space shuttle, and they'd reused parts of it during launch, but it was just really expensive, and it took a long time to turn around those vehicles. Entrepreneurs had come along with the idea of building low cost and in some cases reusable rockets. And I cite some of those in the book, but there's a bunch of examples. A company like Amrock, Beale Aerospace, Microcosm, Xcore. They had a lot of them had talked the same way of Elon did. Like, we should be the FedEx of space, right? In terms of fast, relatively low cost delivery, and they had all failed. And so one of the surprising things about SpaceX is that they not only had this audacious vision, that they were ultimately successful in carrying that out.
So why did they? Why were they the ones who were successful? Like, what set the company apart? Aside from
so that was
millions of Elon's own fortune to like get it started, but why were they the successful ones?
Yeah, I mean, he put $100 million in the company. That seems like a lot of money, but Andy Beale, a Dallas banker, had put $200 million into his company and gave it up after 3 or 4 years. So it's not just money, and that was one of the really things I was interested in looking out and finding out, like why were they successful? Why did they make it sort of through all these hurdles that had tripped up a lot of other companies? And that's the question I would ask all of the early employees that I talked to, dozens of them, and the inescapable sort of primary answer is Elon Musk himself, because he had money, which he put in, yes, but he also had and has this enormous drive. And so he would find really smart people, engineers who were willing to work hard, go out of his way to hire them, and then was extremely good at motivating them, either through incentive or fear or belief in the vision that he was laying out. And so he would ask them to do almost impossible things, and they would, work day and night as hard as they possibly could to achieve that. And then he'd turn around and, give them the next impossible thing that they were supposed to accomplish.
Is it What do you think drives him personally to just constantly say, well, you've done this incredible thing, so that's good. So next.
Yeah, I don't know that I've ever met a person who's more driven than him in terms of his just. I think he wakes up every day thinking, how can we go faster? Or what's a better way to do this that no one's thought of? And why haven't we thought of that?
When did you meet him, if you don't mind me asking?
I first met him in early 2018, and then a number of times since. But he has this drive, and I can't really explain it other than to say that like it's almost exhausting to be around him, because he just like is constantly pushing the people around him forward. So it's as I say, it's you have to attribute a lot of it to him and sort of his desire to be successful.
I mean, I've definitely heard that about many people who sort of become wild successes in any field. I mean, completely like unrelated, but I was watching that Netflix documentary on Michael Jordan recently, the documentary series, and that's the way that a lot of people talk about him, that he was the best, or the best player on the court, or in Elon's case, quite often the smartest guy in the room. But like what he drove other people to do was what ultimately ended up making him as successful as he became, because he couldn't be the star by himself. Yeah.
And that's right. I mean, Elon had a lot of help at SpaceX because he hired very well. And he had a grand enough vision that he attracted some of the youngest and smartest aerospace engineers at the time, then as now, to work at SpaceX. And so that's certainly part of it. His HR person told me that he was directly involved with the first 3,000 hires at SpaceX. Most of them were engineers, but he did the final interviews with them because he knew who he was looking for, and who he wasn't. And so he didn't want to hire duds, and he wanted to make sure the best people would come work for him.
What's your first impression when you walk into SpaceX, and then maybe even like when you get to do that interview with like the man himself? Like what's your first impressions upon like walking into that building? Even
he's kind of it's a cool place, but he's kind of a tall, gangly guy, like a little bit awkward, but very intimidating. Like he's not just Elon Musk. He's like, he doesn't have time for BS or like, small talk. It's like, he's pretty serious when you talk to him. Now he's funny. He tells jokes and things like that, but not right off the bat, right? You don't start out with a knock joke or something like that. He's as I say, he's pretty serious. He's pretty serious. I mean, it's. You'd want to go have a beer with him, but during, while you're having the beer the whole time, you might be a little nervous about saying something stupid. And he'd be like, well, you're an idiot. And then like, basically, tune you out.
I mean, I guess that's what I love about the interviews he does with Joe Rogan. Because like Joe Rogan's not afraid of saying something stupid, which makes for some brilliant conversation.
Yeah. And it helps too. Like if Elon is comfortable around you, right? If he knows you and sort of has a basic level of trust. And now he does not like journalists, and I'm a journalist. But, I've been doing this long enough that he understands where I'm coming from and appreciates the fact that I know what SpaceX had to push through to accomplish what it's accomplished, and sort of have a bigger picture grasp of the U.S., our global space industry.
What do you think was their biggest obstacle that they had to push through? Like, what was the biggest thing that they had to get by before they could say, okay, maybe it's going to be planar sailing from here?
I mean, the biggest thing that they had to do was get a rocket into orbit. And they did that with the Falcon 1, which was a single engine vehicle. And that turns out to be extraordinarily challenging. There's a bunch of startup companies today in the industry who are trying to do just that, and a lot of them are failing. And so that was the huge technical challenge. The problem for SpaceX is that in 2002, no other private company ever built a liquid fueled rocket and launched it from Earth before. They were trying to do it with private capital. So, the military bases where a lot of these rockets launched from, really didn't have much experience with a commercial company. The regulatory agencies didn't have experience with a commercial company. The established companies, the Boeings, the Lockheeds, the Northrops, were not welcoming. Like, they did not appreciate what SpaceX was trying to do to come in and be disruptive. And so they had to plow a lot of ground to even get to a launch site. And then they had all the technical challenges of getting the rocket to orbit. And of course, the first 3 launches failed. And so they were in real big difficulty.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen interviews with Elon Musk talking about how if that 4th rocket had not gone well, that things would potentially have been over. So the whole goal, essentially, from as you mentioned at the start, is to get humans to be multiplanetary. It's Elon Musk and SpaceX aren't the only people who believe that. It's talked about by a reasonable amount of people as something that we need to do. Why, for the layman coming at this, is that the case? What is so crucial about becoming multiplanetary? Surely we should worry about this planet first before we go jetting off to other ones.
And I think Elon would absolutely agree with that. And one of the reasons he founded Tesla or was a part of Tesla was because he felt it was important to break humanity's addiction to fossil fuels. And so if you can build an electric car and then you can get your energy from the sun, then all of a sudden you've tackled one of the biggest problems facing the planet. But he also has existential fears. I think it was Lord Martin Rees who 2 decades wrote a book about how there's sort of all these threats facing humanity, right? You've got the obvious ones like nuclear weapons, climate change could destabilize society and civilization ultimately. You've got the threat of biogenic weapons. And then, you're not sure, humanity's existence is confined to this one world. And it's fairly precarious. And so if something bad happens to the planet or the life on it, it's game over. And that's probably not going to happen in our lifetime, certainly, but it could. And Elon is well, I think humanity ought to have a backup plan. And that doesn't mean we ought to trash Earth and all the rich people should get on a rocket ship and leave. It just means that, he and I think this way, and I think other people do, think that humanity's destiny lies among the stars. And so, one day, we're going to go forward and find Earth-like worlds around other stars, and we'll figure out some way to get there. Whether it's generational ships or cryogenic freezing or faster than light travel, who knows, right? We don't know, but we're never going to get there unless we take the first steps. And in Elon's mind, the best place for humans to make their first step off Earth is on Mars. And so that's why he's been focused. I mean, he did the numbers, and there are other places you could think about in the solar system where maybe it would be a little bit more hospitable for humans, like maybe in caves on the moon, or maybe on Titan, where there's a pretty thick atmosphere, or maybe one of the moons around Jupiter, or maybe in the atmosphere of Venus. But in terms of terrestrial planets, Mars is relatively close as planets go. And it's got some building blocks to work with in terms of a very thin atmosphere and water ice. So it's far from ideal. It's a very hostile place to try to survive, but you got to start somewhere.
So one of the things that I was speaking to a guy who Houston Wade, who's involved in some planning for space mining projects. I was speaking to him last week, and one of the things that he was sort of very keen to emphasize about space exploration is just how bad not being on Earth is for humans. The radiation in space, the different, the lack of atmosphere, the lack of gravity, even down to the soil content of different not very hospitable chemicals on Mars. How much thought do SpaceX give to how long humans can actually survive outside of planet Earth?
Right. So if you're going to go to Mars, you've got to make Mars more habitable. And initially that probably means living inside of domes, and then, figuring out adaptability or trying to make, ultimately terraforming it over decades or centuries. It's an enormous challenge. And I think their philosophy is that all of that is, just chatter. It's just a discussion. It's not real until we have a way to get humans to Mars. And so the first step to making that a reality is to build the transportation system, right? Because right now we have no way to safely get humans to Mars, let alone back. We don't have habitats for them on the surface of Mars. Humans, the Apollo missions, those astronauts were outside of Earth's gravity well for about a week. They were in deep space for about a week at most. And it's, Mars missions are years. So you got to have some way to get people there before you can ask, well, what the hell are you going to do on the surface of Mars, or how are you going to survive there? And so, he's building this Starship vehicle in South Texas, which is kind of, they did the Falcon 1 rocket and the Falcon 9, the Falcon Heavy. It's the next iteration, this much larger launch vehicle, fully reusable. And the idea is that they'll build the rocket and the spacecraft, figure out how to get people to Mars. And then, once we get to Mars, you can start to sort of figure things out. And yeah, it's going to be hard. But pioneers are pioneers, right? There are some people, maybe it's not me, I have a pretty comfortable life here in Houston, Texas, but there's some people who want to be out there pushing forward the frontier, and learning to live on sort of the edge of the world. So, to begin answering those questions, you've got to figure out how to get there. And that's what SpaceX is. Ultimately, it's a transportation company.
So they're just the idea is that, yeah, you have to build stage one to get to the next questions. Essentially, you have to unlock the first stage before you can get to the questions about how we're like going to live there long term. Is there any talk of like artificial gravity stuff? Because I've seen some startups like talking about this, but I've never seen it being like seriously discussed.
So Mars is one nice thing about Mars is it has about a third of Earth's gravity. So there is enough gravity there, we think, that human bodies could adapt to it fairly easily. And that's one good thing about Mars. Now, the question is, do you want to have artificial gravity on the way to Mars, so your bones don't get weaker and you have other health effects from that, which we've seen on the International Space Station? I think SpaceX's answer is we should get there as fast as we can. So 5 or 6 months. But that's definitely an issue. And where artificial gravity I think comes into more play is there's also an idea espoused by Jeff Bezos and other people that no, we ought not to be living on planets because other planets in the solar system aren't that good compared to Earth. We ought to be living in these large orbital habitats, and those would spin to have some kind of artificial gravity. But the fact is, there's been very little research done by NASA or any other space agency or private company on artificial gravity. So it's from a technological standpoint, we've got a ways to go.
So one of the things that I find like difficult to get in my head is when we're talking about building, for example, the Starship that they're building to go to Mars, is that going to be 100% assembled on Earth, or is they going to be assembling it in space?
That is 100% assembled on Earth. And right now, the amazing thing about Starship is they're building that vehicle in tents in South Texas out of rolls of stainless steel. And he's created this manufacturing process in South Texas that is remarkable. It's something the space industry has never seen before. And so they're going through this test campaign. They're blowing up Starships. Yes. But the idea is that you would build those on Earth and then launch them, and then you would refuel them. So it takes a lot of energy for a vehicle like Starship to get to orbit. around Earth, and then from there less so. But the idea is that you would get to Starship to orbit with empty tanks, and then have a different Starship, basically Starship tanker, that gets to orbit with some fuel, and then offloads that fuel into the Starship carrying people or whatever, and then that goes on to the moon or to Mars.
Oh, it's so wild trying to think about this. Because I know it's real, but in my head it's still also like sci-fi. Do you know what I mean?
Well, I think that's one of the reasons why people like what SpaceX is doing. Take Elon Musk. Some people like him, some don't. He's certainly controversial. He's certainly broken some eggs on his way to becoming successful. Strong-headed, but he does not see a future where, so I'm 48, if SpaceX didn't exist, I would be very skeptical of whether humans ever walked on Mars in my lifetime. And if they did, it would be like 2 to 4 people sort of that NASA sends there 20 years from now. That's a pretty limiting future for space exploration. And so what people like about Musk is that he sees the potential of much more than that. So he sees starships taking dozens of people at a time from Earth to Mars, and then landing them on Mars, and then some people come back and some people stay. And that is a very much a sci-fi future, but it's also within our grasp. I mean, they are literally building these vehicles, and SpaceX has had enough success now with what it's done that you can't dismiss the possibility that maybe he's right.
I mean, they've definitely made more progress than anyone ever imagined was possible when they were first getting started. So one of the things that I was speaking to the space mining guy about was that he was explaining essentially how he believes that the space race will unfold over the next 30 to 40 years, in that we'll have some sort of space Wild West. There's probably going to be attempts by some nations to militarize space, that there's going to be like a rush to take advantage of all of the minerals, metals, and things that you can get on the moon. He was talking about helium-3 or H3. Which, he was talking about iron ore, finding asteroids around the Kuiper Belt and different parts of the solar system. And he essentially sort of envisioned, once things get going, he believed it would kick off very quickly, because the amount of money to be made from these minerals would be so unfathomably huge. Where do you see the space race going over the next, what are the next stages of things? So we've got plans for a couple of manned missions to Mars by SpaceX, and I think NASA are involved in one, as far as I'm aware. And there's like the race to be the first people to put someone on Mars. Like, what are the next steps, do you think, after that?
I think in the near term, the race is actually to the moon. So you have NASA with its Artemis program, and they're partnering with SpaceX, among other companies, to try to make human landing on the moon and have a more sustainable presence in the second half of this decade. And that's a race between the United States and China, which is also very interested in that. And there's also sort of a geopolitical element to this, in the fact that the United States is trying to get partners like Europe and Canada and the UAE and Australia, and anyone else who wants to come along with Artemis. But China is trying to get partners from Europe and Russia and other places to go with them. And so that's the near term. Long term, I agree that there are lots of resources in space, and it could come through asteroid mining or through lunar colonies or Martian colonies. It's not really clear. But once we figure out a way to economically harvest those resources and bring them back to Earth. And again, that could be rare earth metals from an asteroid. It could be some kind of space-based solar power system where you're beaming electricity back to Earth. It's not entirely clear to me what that will be. But once you do get to the point where there is money to be made in space, then you will see this enormous rush of activity. And I think one of the things that's really exciting about where we are right now, with SpaceX, but also with other companies, is that for a long time, the gate or the limiting factor on all that opportunity was the cost of accessing space. And so if you could only launch, every 6 months for $200 or $300 million, that's pretty limiting to your business plan. But if you can ride up on a SpaceX Falcon 9 rocket, every month for 30 or 40 or $50 million, that opens up a lot of different economic activity. And so we're seeing launch costs come down through the innovation of reusable rockets. And that is going to open up economic activity in space. And I think at some point we will hit a tipping point. We're not there yet. I don't know what the economic activity will be. But I do agree that once that tipping point is reached, it will really open up the floodgates.
And one of the things that's always sort of discussed as part of the expansion to space is space tourism. Now that's as long as I can remember, I have been reading about how we're so close to space tourism. I used to have these like science folders that my cousin had given me, I think they were called Quest, and it was just loads of like futuristic stories about science and tech and like trying to envision what the world would be like. And as far as I remember from then, it was always like, oh, in 10 years we may have people like space tourism. And I'm constantly underwhelmed by the lack of options for going to the ISS for my holidays. And constantly wondering if it's actually like a realistic possibility as part of the space race, because that seems to be the thing that a lot of people focus on. It's like, oh, soon we'll be able to send people into space. And I'm like, that's only going to work for as many people as you can convince to do it for the astronomical price it's going to be. It doesn't seem like a huge part of the space experience, or this like the next stage of our expansion as a species. So how much thought do SpaceX and well, yourself as well think or put into whether space tourism is going to be a big part of it, or is it kind of just left to the media almost to speculate about something that's not that relevant to the industry?
That's a great question. And I think that story, we're only really beginning to write it. I do think we are on the cusp of seeing more space tourism, in September of this year. So just in a few months from now, and all civilian crew is going to launch on a Crew Dragon. So SpaceX's Crew Dragon, there's this Inspiration 4 mission where you've got 4 people, no astronauts, entirely private mission in the low Earth orbit. And so that's pretty remarkable. We've never seen anything like that. Another almost all private mission will be launching on Crew Dragon early next year, and they're going to visit the International Space Station. That's the Ax-1 mission. And then Blue Origin, probably within a month or two, is going to put people on its New Shepard capsule for the first time. That vehicle, like Virgin Galactic, is suborbital. So there's a big difference between going up for a few minutes of weightlessness, like you get with New Shepard, again, built by Blue Origin, or Virgin Galactic's Spaceship Two. So the suborbital trips are probably going to run $250,000 to $300,000, which is a lot of money. And it's basically like you go up, you have a few minutes of weightlessness, you look down on the Earth and you see the sphere, and it's very cool, but then you come back down. The suborbital, the orbital flights by SpaceX are still like $50 million a person. So that's really expensive. And I don't see a whole lot of change in that over the next decade. That this again is where Starship has, the SpaceX vehicle Starship has the potential to be a game changer, because Starship could launch both suborbital and orbital flights. And so one of the potential use cases for Starship is like almost like a rocket powered airplane, in that it takes off from South Texas and lands in Japan 45 minutes later. And as part of this, you actually go on a suborbital hop. So like you go up above space and come back down. And so you could have like that mission, or like a new Glenn, or excuse me, a New Shepard or Virgin Galactic experience, but also like it's called point-to-point transportation. And what's unique about Starship is it's not like 4 people like are on Virgin Galactic or 6 people on New Shepard. You could literally have like 60 people on Starship, or maybe even more, depending on how they break out the seating, because it's a very large vehicle. And if that were the case, then you're minting several dozen astronauts on every flight, and point-to-point travel probably would be far less, like thousands of dollars, not hundreds of thousands of dollars. So again, like Starship is where a lot of our hopes, I think, are being pinned in terms of space tourism.
Do you feel that's more of a gimmick though, or do you think that's like an industry that people will pay like serious attention to?
I don't know. I do think there's lots of interest in like being able to go halfway around the world in an hour. Especially as we get out of the pandemic and the world is increasingly global. And so there's a lot of thought being given to supersonic travel. We're seeing a renaissance in that with companies like Boom Supersonic, but then Starship offers a different approach. There's lots of logistical issues to deal with, and you've got to make the vehicle safe. And those are all serious challenges. But there's definitely some potential there. Yeah.
Do you ever see the government essentially just taking their hands out of like space exploration as an entity? Do you ever see just it being entirely private space exploration, or do you think there'll always be like a European Space Agency, NASA, there'll be like a Chinese program?
I think there will always be national space agencies. The question is, what will they be doing? And they'll be doing the things that aren't economically viable. Like right now, there's no financial incentive to send rovers to Mars, and it's extraordinarily expensive to do that. It's a $2 billion mission or whatever Perseverance is. And so, no one is making a profit back for that. But it's perfect for a government space agency to spend $80 million to stick a small helicopter on Perseverance and then see if it flies like it did this morning with Ingenuity. So I think the government role is to be out there further and trying to find technologies that maybe, private companies then will commercialize. But the days of NASA building rockets are almost over because the private sector does it so much better.
Now, I'm keen to how detailed can you go on that new style of engineering you were talking about in Texas, where they're like using like rolls of sheet metal? Like how can you explain to me like what's revolutionary about that, what's so special about it?
So there's two basic methods of design and engineering. There's linear and iterative, and by and large, the space industry has operated through linear design. So that means that you'll spend a while figuring out, okay, this is the kind of rocket or spacecraft we want, and then sort of spending years designing the hell out of that vehicle to make it look or operate the way you want it, and then you sort of start to do some subsystem tests, and then you build the different components, and then you assemble them, and then 10 years later, you've got this enormously expensive vehicle. You've built one of them, and you're going to fly it, and you better hope it works, because if it fails, you've got to spend 2 more years building the next one. The good thing about that design method is that oftentimes the first time out it does work, because you spent so long, as I say, engineering it to death and figuring out all the failure modes. And there could be 100 failure modes, but only 1 or 2 of them will actually get you in flight. So what SpaceX has done is they've said, okay, it's all right to fail when we're developing these vehicles. That's okay, because it's going to allow us to go much faster. And so, yeah, they'll do some engineering design and analysis, but very early in the process, they'll start building. And they'll once they get a prototype ready, they'll go fly it, and the thing will fail, but they'll get a lot of data and they'll understand why it failed. And then they'll build the next one better, and then they'll get data from that. And maybe they'll go higher, or maybe they'll almost land, or maybe they'll do this, and they'll learn about, okay, well, this was the problem there, so we can make it better. And so it's instead of spending years and years doing this theoretical work, they're getting practical experience data, like real world data from the vehicle. And that just allows you to go much faster, because you plow your learnings into new vehicles. And the problem is, for NASA, for a traditional government contractor, it's bad if stockholders see you fail, right? It looks bad. Congress doesn't like to see NASA fail. But Elon Musk very early on said failure is an option at SpaceX, and he's lived up to that.
Yeah, I think he said that at the minute when they're doing a lot of the testing, is that they're expecting it to crash. If it doesn't, they're incredibly happy, and they're building it. They're essentially building it with the idea that it will crash, which seems insane. It's like you don't build a car with the idea it's going to blow up halfway around the track. Like,
yeah, for sure.
So for you, what's like the most, do you have like a fact about SpaceX that is like something that just you go, no, that can't be true, or you tell people and they're like, what, or like, what's your like most interesting or shocking fact about the company?
Sure. So, so since 2005, NASA's been developing the Orion spacecraft. And I don't know if you've heard of it, but this is the capsule that will go on top of the Space Launch System rocket and will carry 4 astronauts out to the moon and back. And so it's a little bigger than the Apollo capsules in the 1960s, but same kind of design, same kind of purpose, going to the moon and back and landing in the ocean. And it's modernized. But NASA has spent 16 years developing the vehicle and more than $20 billion. And it's a boilerplate version of the vehicle, did one flight in 2014, and it has not flown yet again. It may fly next year, and it might fly humans in maybe 3 years. So 16 years and more than $20 billion. So I'll go back to 2005 and what SpaceX has accomplished since 2005 for less money from all sources than NASA has spent on Orion. They've launched 120 rockets, right? They've developed the Falcon 1, Falcon 9, Falcon Heavy, and they're working on Starship. They've delivered more than 20 supply missions to the International Space Station. They've launched 2 crews and are about to launch a 3rd crew to the space station this week. They have more satellites in orbit than any company or country in the world with the Starlink constellation. They've done all of this groundbreaking work in reuse and reflight. And so that is the promise of commercial space versus the traditional way that the government and its contractors have operated. So SpaceX is just this absolute revolution in terms of what the private sector can do in an ideal situation. And again, a lot of that is due to sort of the vision and the action of Elon Musk.
You almost forget about the Starlink program as well. How close to completion are they with that?
They're still far away. I mean, they want to eventually put thousands or tens of thousands of satellites, and they have about 1,400 on orbit right now. But they've opened up a beta, and I think by the end of the year, almost everyone in North America will be able to use the service. So it's a lot closer, I think, than people realize.
That's really wild. Like anytime you talk about one of Elon Musk's projects, it really does sound like a Bond villain in the making.
Yeah, for sure. Fortunately, I'm genuinely convinced he wants to help the world. Like, he gets painted as villain, and I mean, he can be a not nice person, right? For sure. So, as I say, you got to take the good with the bad.
I couldn't agree more. So what sort of timescale do you see us becoming that multiplanetary species that we talked about? Are we talking 20 years? Are we talking like 50 years? What do you think?
Elon wants it to happen in his lifetime, and he's about to turn 50. I think he would be disappointed if we didn't send humans to Mars before 2030. That seems extraordinarily aggressive to me. But I could see them launching a human mission to Mars in the early 2030s for sure. I would not bet against that, which would be extraordinarily soon.
But then, when I imagine us as a multi-planetary species, I see us having, maybe not just a base on Mars, maybe on Titan, like you mentioned, maybe on the moon, maybe on a couple of other moons in the solar system. How do you genuinely see that as like a realistic possibility? Say even before 2100?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the first most expensive step is developing the transportation system. And so if you get that down, if all of a sudden it is possible to get 100 tons to low Earth orbit for a certain amount of money, which is maybe a factor of 10 lower than what it was before, then all of a sudden you open up all these possibilities of things you could do in space that you couldn't envision before. And that, I think, is what's so powerful about SpaceX, is it has taken on this first most challenging step head on and said, we're going to solve this problem. And then that's going to open up the door to all these other activities. And they're having some success.
Like getting stuff off the ground is the biggest, obviously the biggest issue. How much do SpaceX like discuss 3D printing stuff once they actually get into orbit or into onto the moon or to Mars? Like how much do you think we could realistically 3D print once off the planet?
That's not something SpaceX has really tackled. There are other private companies out there doing it, like Made in Space, that have thought a lot about that and have actually printed things on the International Space Station. And so I think there's lots of materials on the surface of the moon to work with, and on Mars as well. But we've got to go there and figure it out and experiment. Like I said, there's only so much you can do with like simulated soil from the moon or simulated soil on Mars. You really have to be there, hands-on trying it out.
Yeah, I mean, I do not want to volunteer for the first missions, but I wish them well.
Yeah.
So what are the most interesting things then for people coming up in the next year or two to watch out for? You mentioned those manned space flights or the civilian space flights. Is there anything else we should be looking out for?
I think the two really exciting things this year to watch and see are, first of all, China has a rover Tianwen in orbit around the surface of Mars. I think sometime in late May or June, they're going to try to land that mission. And no space agency other than NASA has ever successfully soft landed a rover on the surface of Mars, or even a lander for that matter. So that's a huge step for them, their space program, something to watch for. And then, the Starship test that SpaceX is doing in South Texas. They've been flying up to about 10 to 12 kilometers and trying to land and haven't been fully successful yet, but they're probably going to try again either later this week or next and then keep going. And so how fast that program moves forward also will be super interesting to look out for.
So before we wrap up, do you want to tell people where they can get your book?
Yeah, I mean, Liftoff is on Amazon, of course, but it should be in bookstores everywhere. And it's getting, tremendous reviews on Amazon and Goodreads and everywhere else. So it seems to be people like it.
Well, awesome. I will link it in the description below. So Eric, thanks a lot. It's been a real pleasure to chat about SpaceX.
Josh, thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
No problem. Thanks so much for listening. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe, follow me on Twitter, or sign up to our mailing list. Thanks a lot to our sponsor, ExpressVPN, the #1 most trusted VPN. Get lightning fast connectivity with servers in 160 locations across 94 countries. Keep your browsing privacy safe with ExpressVPN and get a 35% discount on 12 months of ExpressVPN when you follow the link in the description below. Don't forget my book is now out and available to order on Amazon and on bookshop.org. That's Brexit, the Establishment Civil War. And most importantly, thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.